Hi, I'm Benton Stokes,
And I'm Elaine O'Rourke.
and this is Cocktail Theology. Hi there, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really good.
Good. You were at the secular job today.
I was, yeah. I make coffee sometimes in my secular job. It is a Sunday, and it's a little strange for me to be at my secular job on a Sunday. But the team was short-staffed today, and I am asking off quite a lot of time this summer, so I'm trying to do favors where they're useful. So,
You know you're going to hell for not going to
Well,
church today, right?
I know.
But I'll be with you.
That's true. Well, and we're drinking, so there's double hell.
Okay, well, good to know. Good to know. You know, it's as long as we can just kind of make it quickly through the layers of hell, we should be fine.
Yeah, we'll be
Okay.
all right.
Yeah, we'll be fine. So what are we drinking today, friend?
We are drinking another cocktail from our Cocktail Theology cocktail book. We call it the CT Berry Gimlet. A traditional gimlet is gin, not a vodka gimlet, but a true gimlet is
Thank
gin
you.
and
Thank you for
lime.
that distinction.
Yeah, because some people,
No,
you know,
no. Not in this house.
not in this house. But we added the element of berry using creme de cassis, which is a liqueur that is, some people refer to it more as blackberry, some as black currant. It's yummy. It's sweet and kind of syrupy, so you use it sort of sparingly, but it's really, really good. It has gin, and today we're actually using a reposado gin.
That's rye.
Yeah, it's really tasty. It's a very kind of bold and rich gin.
Love it. It's also from St. George.
And it's from St. George, yeah. So a California gin. And then we're mixing that with the creme de cassis in a small amount. It has sweetened lime. It also has a sweet vermouth. And then it has a little bit of grapefruit bitters, just to brighten it up a tad. And then you added lemon peel.
I did.
And it's really surprisingly bold.
Yeah, it is.
I don't generally think of gin drinks as being bold necessarily. They tend to be kind of lighter or floral or botanical, or sometimes there's a little spice or whatever. And the nice thing about gins is that they're so grounded in wherever they're distilled. So whatever the botanicals are, or whatever's in the ground really in those areas, is what comes out in the gins. And so that's why gins vary so widely. So when somebody says, I don't like gins because they taste like a pine tree, well, they just haven't tried gin, really.
Right.
They've had like one or two very specific gins.
Juniper forward is what we
Right.
say in the trade.
Exactly. So this is a really balanced, kind of bold but delicious drink.
And I do want to say, for anybody who's trying to replicate it the way we just described, or the way you just described it, the sweet vermouth we're using is Carpano Antico, which is a little more delicate than the stuff that's commonly lying around. It's a little drier, which I think goes beautifully with the rye reposado gin.
It really
I think
does.
It just really just links in, and it also lightens up the cassis a little bit. So, yeah.
It's really delicious. And these are not exactly the ingredients in our cocktail book. We varied from the recipe based on what we had and came up with something really, really nice.
Here's a thought. So tonight we're talking about science.
We are.
And it occurs to me that what we were talking about just now, there's some real scientific differences in the various ingredients we talked about.
Yes.
Okay? So different flavors come out because of different chemistry of the flavors and the way it interacts with your body and the way your palate picks it up, or the scent affects your nose.
Very true.
Science is not bad.
Science is not bad. That is what we're talking about. More specifically, we're talking about Christians and science. Historically, there have always been schools of thought within Christianity that wanted to push against science. Either wanted to pretend it didn't exist, ignore it, or revolt against it, or run the other way. So we wanted to kind of talk about that. Some of the, ways in our modern times that we've seen Christians or certain schools of thought within Christianity sort of butt heads with science have been around things like evolution and even other more common scientific law, like law now that they're no longer considered theoretical, but at one time were problems for Christians because it somehow butted heads with their view of the world, the creation, God, etc.
That's right.
And then, of course, more recently, climate change is an area where a lot of Christians disagree with a lot of common thought around the scientific reasons for why our climate is changing. Some Christians even deny the fact that our climate is changing substantially. And then even more recently around COVID and vaccines, how they work, and why we should or should not get vaccines, particularly around COVID, although there have been issues with vaccines in other seasons and other diseases and whatever. But I'm wondering, where does this come from? Why do some Christians, seem to have such an aversion to scientific thought? Why do they see it as a threat to their faith?
Yikes. As I want to do, I want to distinguish between a few things.
Mm-hmm.
I want to distinguish between scientific method, which is experiment, test, draw a theory, right? Or confirm a theory, which in practice, nobody has any trouble with. The most black and white, narrow-viewed Christian, when cooking, will experience an experiment with how long something should cook. That's scientific method.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's set aside scientific method for a minute. Okay. So when we're talking about science, and the big air quotes that I'm like saying right now around it, what we're usually talking about is, this is a really unfair way to put it, but I'm going to be unfair to the other side as well. We're talking about the monolith that seems to be a cultural wall of opinion. So when we say science says blah, blah, we're lying because science is not a thing that can say anything.
Right.
Okay. But what happens is we set up science against everything else. And so if you're on the side that says science says, and that means it must be true, contra everything else, or you're on the side that says science is untrustworthy and therefore it must be false, whichever wall you're standing on, you're going to have the same position. So the same people who are anti-religion because you can't apply scientific method to it are the same people who would be anti-science if they had a different set of parameters for proof.
I see what you mean, yeah.
So a lot of the problems we've got in any of these kinds of arguments are that each group has standards of proof that are different and incompatible without an acknowledgement the other side might have a point. Okay? So that's the first piece. And that one is impossible to overcome as long as people feel like they have a stake in the ground over their particular opinion, regardless of what their particular opinion is.
Yes.
Now, we can trace some of this back to the Enlightenment, which, I have a very mixed feeling about. But a lot of it is this kind of ridiculous battle between science, the monolith, and religion, the monolith. So let's set that aside for a minute, okay? Because those people are the same people on both sides.
Sure.
Instead, let's talk about it in terms, and I think that the examples you brought up are really useful. So there's evolution, there's vaccination, and what was the other one? Oh, climate change. Okay. So I would suggest to you this. The big challenge with evolution is that it seems to contradict a literal reading of the myth of Genesis. For people who believe that Genesis is a literal blow-by-blow description of what God did in the first 6 days of all of this. Days meaning 24 hours, nighttime, God slept. I don't know what happened during that time. But, right. There's no way to deal with macroevolution. Microevolution, they can adjust to, right? But the big things, they don't work together. On the other hand, the people on the other side have the same problem because they don't see it as myth either, right? Okay, there's that one. The one for climate change, in my view, is more about a discomfort with responsibility.
Yeah, right.
Okay?
Right.
I don't think that most of the deniers of climate change are denying it on the basis of science or not science, or religion or not religion. They're denying it on the fact they're uncomfortable with the idea that humans actually could affect it. Then they tie it back to religion by saying, why would God make it so that humans could affect things? We'll just let that one sit for a moment, right?
Right.
And then you've got the people who use the conspiracy of climate change to justify the destruction of the world that has to come before we get, right? So there's that whole thing.
Yeah.
In the case of COVID and vaccines, except for the people who really have severe doubts about vaccines on the basis of a religious view of bodies and such, and that one we're setting aside for a moment because it's a completely different kind of way of thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it has anything to do with science. What I more see is it has to do with personal pride, and again, that stake in the ground. I'm willing to literally die on this hill so that you're wrong.
Yeah, that's what it feels like to me.
Again, I think the challenge that we have as people of faith or as people of science is teasing out what's really going on for individuals who take stands. If I am a physicist who says, if I can't measure it, it doesn't exist, I have to figure out why am I stuck on human measurement as a way of proving existence when I've been guessing about that's a gross exaggeration, but I mean guessing about black holes for a very long time. Right? So it's not whether they're right or wrong, but they have to look at why they're doing that.
Why they're doing that.
We have to do the same thing when science and apparently religion come into conflict. Because very often it's not actually about either the tenets of science or the tenets of religion. It's about how do I deal with conflicting information? How do I say, wow, you may have a point, I may be wrong, or I may have to adjust, or I may have to find a way to deal with complexity. Most people I have ever met in my life don't really love complexity.
Yeah, and we don't deal well in gray areas, and we don't deal well with unanswered questions.
I think it's one of the reasons so many churches really sort of live in the Hebrew scriptures and in a very narrow view of the Hebrew scriptures, rather than living in what feels more ambiguous, like Jesus. When Jesus says, it's all about love God, love your neighbor, well, where's the darn laws in that?
Exactly. A lot of Christians, a lot of churches feel the need to have answers for everything. Yes. Very simple, direct answers for everything. Because this is how you know that you're living right. That's right. Is that you live within these boundaries.
That's right.
And so we create these boundaries. And I think you're right. I think so much of it goes back to the Hebrew scriptures because the Jews had very specific boundaries that they lived within. If you start challenging those boundaries, well, then, if that's not true, what if this isn't true? And so those are the hills that people will die on because the way they live their life, the way they see the world, the way they see themselves, and the way they see God is all wrapped up in this worldview.
Right.
It could be tiny, tiny, tiny and very, very restrictive, but this is where they live. And if you take them outside of that,
that's right,
they don't know what to do.
That's
and
right.
They're scared to death.
Absolutely.
So I think you're right. The ambiguity around living a New Testament Christian life is very scary for many, many Christians.
Absolutely. And I would say the same thing for certain adherents to a certain view of science.
We leave no room for mystery.
There's no room for mystery. The idea that we might not know and might never know is extremely uncomfortable to that subset of scientists. Now, I know a whole bunch of scientists who are comfortable with complexity, and it doesn't really bother them that there are things that we might never know.
Right.
So whether you want to attribute all of your knowledge and all the knowledge that could ever be had at any point to science or to religion, it doesn't matter. You're still dying, and in this case, dying for the idea that, in fact, your view is correct.
Right.
So where it actually, though, comes into conflict, I think is a more interesting thing, is when we talk about things like healing. You hear about people who have been in comas for a long time. And One set of people says, you know what? They're not going to come out of it. There's no substantial brainwave, or there's no brainwave. This person is clinically dead. You're just keeping their bodily cells functioning on, that kind of thing. Then you've got the other side that says, well, but if you unplug them, you're playing God. The truth is somewhere in the discomfort of that. So the question is, if I keep running current or fluids or whatever through a body, is that playing God? If I stop doing that, is that playing God? When we look at healing that happens because of a particular medical intervention, is that playing God? Can we still give credit to God for the fact that that medical intervention exists? Or do we have to say, no, CPR is a human-made thing? Or can we say, yeah, but God's in there in just inspiring the person to figure, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's a more interesting question to me. How do we make sense out of a God who permeates everything, who is involved in our lives intimately, and things that seem to be really kind of in the hands of a particular human being? Why can't we find a way to see both? If an ambulance driver happens to hit green lights and gets my relative to the hospital on time, I'm not going to credit the guy who invented green lights. I'm going to credit God.
Yeah, right.
If the ambulance driver doesn't hit the green lights and doesn't get my relative I'm going to be looking at what? God? Stupid red lights? How do we in fact attribute the things that are difficult for us? How do we in fact make sense out of that when we're talking about physical cause and effect, science, our understanding of God's permeation? That's a more interesting question.
Yeah, and it's all a part of our theology, and it's all a part of our worldview.
That's right.
Because it really does come down to, how do you view God? What kind of God do you worship? What kind of God do you serve?
That's right. Everything I have seen points to God as being far more creative than I give God credit for, and far more comfortable in our having mystery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I personally find a mysterious God much more interesting.
Far more interesting.
Even if it causes uncomfortable questions for myself.
I think any God who's not comfortable with the laws of physics.
Since God wrote the book on physics to begin with.
You see my problem here?
Right.
Yeah. So again, I think it's actually less about scientific method or grasping faith. It's about whether you need clear boundaries to whatever it is you're dealing with. Now let's also lift up during this time people who are willing to create conspiracy theories that... I saw your face. Okay, he rarely makes faces when we're doing... I'm always the one who's making faces. He's making a face right now, right? Okay, the people who create or adhere to conspiracy theories about anything because they don't want to do whatever the thing is.
Right.
Okay, there are conspiracy theories that were in fact conspiracies that are real. However, my being uncomfortable with something does not mean that someone's acting against me. It may just mean that I don't want to do it.
Right. It's creating like some sort of weird alternate reality where your view is the right view, even as wackadoo as your view might be.
Well, I wouldn't use the technical term wackadoo.
I like wackadoo personally.
Do you? But yeah, I mean, and again, it comes back to, how do we understand ourselves? Are we willing to say, could I be wrong? Could I be wrong? Could I have some piece of information wrong? Or could I not have enough information? And if we're not able to do that, if we're not able to take in the possibility that there may be information that conflicts with mine that I need to consider, we're going to be either on one wall or another wall.
Yeah. I would say from personal experience that if I had never come to the point where I could ask myself the question, could I be wrong about this? All of the growth that has happened in my spiritual life in the last 10 years would not have happened.
That's right.
There has to be a crack in the door somewhere.
That's right. And I would say the same thing is true for any advances in science.
Absolutely.
Could I be wrong about this? Because that's how you start doing the experimentation.
Well, right. And so many great finds in science happen accidentally.
Or they seem to have happened accidentally.
Yeah. That's not the intended
Exactly.
outcome.
Exactly.
And yet, there we are.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think there has to be room for mystery.
Yeah. And I would add to that both we have to make room for mystery and we have to be humble about what we believe or what we think we believe. We have to be humble about it. We have to go about our lives making the best choices we can and being willing to say, wait a minute, is it possible I'm wrong?
Mm-hmm.
For example, if I say to you, you know what? You should have used unsweetened lime.
In this cocktail?
What I'm encouraging you to do is to say, could I have been wrong about the sweetened lime? And then what should we do? We do science. We experiment.
We try it with unsweetened lime.
And see if that actually is better. If it is, we have had a new scientific discovery inspired by God.
It's true. And for our listeners, that happens all the time around here. I wonder if we should have tried that vermouth instead, or that gin instead. Let's do it now.
And let's give thanks to God for a range of gin and vermouth.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. What do you guys think? Science is a loaded topic for many Christians, and feel free to respectfully and politely email us with dissenting opinions if you have them. Mm-hmm. You can reach us at Elane, E-L-A-N-E, or Benton, B-E-N-T-O-N, at schoolforseekers.com. We would love to know where you stand on these kinds of issues. And we would also love to know if you have maybe previously, as I was, one of those folks that thought they had it all figured out and discovered that you didn't. And what did that do for your faith life? What did that do for your life?
And I would like to say that if you're on the range of science and you happen to be listening to us because there was cocktails in our name, and you're thinking to yourself, oh, these religious people, they're so gullible, they're so whatever. I'd like to know how it is that you are having challenges with opening your possibilities.
Yeah, I like that.
That's it.
I like that.
All my friends are scientists except for the guy across the table from me. So there we are.
Fair enough. Thanks, you guys, for listening. Share us liberally because that's how we grow this audience.
And absolutely not conservatively because we don't do that.
No, don't share us conservatively. In fact, we don't really do much of anything conservatively. Thanks, you guys, for listening. Bye.
Bye.